Welcome, everyone. We're at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Melanie Ross, and I will be the facilitator for our webinar today. Our presenter is Keith Mowry. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on the unprecedented developments of ISO IEC 17065. Please note that we are recording this webinar, so it will be available on the ANAB website for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter any questions into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that were asked. Keith Mowry is a senior manager of business development at ANAB. He represents ANAB on the ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee, which is the U.S. National Mirror Committee to ISO CASCO. He served as an ICAC chair for over 20 years and has 30 years of experience with ISO standards and guides for conformity assessment. Keith presents many webinars for ANAB, including another one next week with Vijay Krishna on 17024, so stay tuned for that. With that, Keith, I'll turn it over to you and let you get started.
Well, thanks so much, Melanie, and hi to everybody. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you today. Now, you may not think about 17065 as being unprecedented. It's certainly been around for a long time. But today I'm going to try to show you that connection. And in the process, I want to try to connect the recent and current developments regarding 17065. Just briefly to start with some basics, 17065 is one of the ISO IEC 17000 series standards. Those are the standards that are numbered between 17000 and 17067. And they deal with conformity assessment. As a group, they're often called the CASCO Toolbox, and many of them are co-branded with IEC. Now, the core of the 17000 series standards are standards that set requirements for conformity assessment bodies and accreditation bodies. And 17065 is one of those core standards. Specifically, it sets requirements for bodies performing product, process, and service certification. And it is under the responsibility of ISO CASCO, and that's where we get the nickname of the CASCO Toolbox. Now, what is ISO CASCO? Well, ISO CASCO is the ISO Policy Committee on Conformity Assessment. And in its policy role, it provides support on conformity assessment matters to the ISO Council. Now, the ISO Council is one of the governance bodies within ISO. But actually, the majority of the time and effort in ISO CASCO is spent in the development and maintenance of the 17000 series of standards. Now, when ISO CASCO does this work, it follows the ISO directives, just like any other ISO technical committee would do. However, ISO CASCO does not use subcommittees to be responsible for one or several of the standards it publishes. So there is no standing subcommittee within ISO CASCO that's responsible for 17065. Instead, when ISO CASCO needs to develop or revise a standard, it establishes a brand new working group. And the working group does its work, and then after the work is over, the working group is dissolved. And we're going to see the impact of this on 17065 and some recent developments a little later on. Where did 17065 come from? Well, 17065, which is an international standard, was written to replace ISO IEC Guide 65, which was published in 1996. Guide 65, while it was a guide, did set requirements for product certification. And it had actually replaced ISO IEC Guide 40, which goes all the way back to 1983. Now, the development of 17065 took 6 years. In the fall of 2006, the CASCO plenary took a resolution to develop 17065 as a replacement for Guide 65, and 17065 was finally published in the fall of 2012. Now, obviously, this was way before COVID, right? And ISO CASCO formed Working Group 29 to do this work of creating 17065, and all the meetings were face-to-face. We did not have remote participation technology really in effect at the time. And the work took so long that we went through 2 different conveners. Our first convener led us for about 4 years, and then we were lucky enough to have a second convener who came on board for the last few years to finish the work. Working Group 29 was broken up into subgroups that would write different pieces of 17065, and then there was a small drafting group that combined all the pieces into the drafts that actually got balloted. So the length of time and the amount of work, the number of hours the working group spent to develop 17065 is still unprecedented in the history of CASCO. There has not been an effort that's been more extensive than 17065 before or since. Now, there were several reasons why it took so long to develop the standard. It's because it was really unique in a variety of aspects. First, 17065, when it was developed, was based on what was then the new concepts of the functional approach in ISO IEC 17000-2004. So that was new at the time, right? It's not new to us now. Now we're all accustomed to it. But that was the first standard to be wholly based on these new concepts in ISO IEC 17000. In addition, Working Group 29 took the decision that we would write 17065 so that it would be applicable to certification bodies of all sizes and all range of operations, from the smallest, local, most narrowly focused certification body to the largest, most broadly focused multinational certification body. And at the time it was developed, the emergence of multinational certification bodies was still maturing. It was still a work in progress. Third, we wanted to write 17065 so there were no limitations or requirements on certification schemes for product, process, and service certification. Now, this was a big change from Guide 65. And to this day, 17065 accommodates the broadest range and type of schemes of any standard for a body in the CASCO toolbox. And finally, 17065 has been and is the only 17,000 series standard to normatively reference other 17,000 series standards. So all these different facets explain why it took such a long time, because we were setting a lot of new precedents. Now, so 17065 is published in 2012, and subject to the ISO IEC directives, it undergoes a periodic review. Specifically, per the directives, if a standard is not revised for 5 years, then it's required that it undergo a systematic review ballot. So between 2012 and 2017, there were no proposals and no resolutions for the revision of ISO IEC 17065, and so, per the directives, a systematic review ballot was issued. And at that time, the ISO CASCO member bodies, the individual countries that are participating members in CASCO, they voted to confirm 17065, which simply means continue to publish it. We're not going to open it up and revise it. So at that point, the next systematic review would be set for 2023. Now you're saying, well, wait a minute, that's 6 years and not 5. Well, that's because the systematic review ballot for 17065, by a decision by CASCO, was linked to a similar systematic review for its sister standard, ISO IEC 17067. which is a standard that provides guidance on product, process, and service certification schemes. So we were all teed up, ready to go for a 2023 systematic review. But before that systematic review happened, the ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee, the ICAC, and this is the U.S. member body to ISO CASCO, ANSI proposed a resolution for 17065, and the resolution was to make only minor revisions. ANSI proposed that the stability and effectiveness of 17065 meant that we didn't need to make a big set of revisions, but some minor revisions were needed. And we even included a candidate for the convener of the working group that would be formed if this proposal was accepted. Well, that proposal was turned down by ISO CASCO. The CASCO Secretariat noted that there really isn't anything in the ISO directives that allows for this kind of a minor or limited revision. ANSI came back and said, well, there's nothing that prohibits it either, But, you know, when you get into that kind of a discussion, we all know that ISO is going to have the final say, and so that proposal was not balloted. So here we come to the systematic review. And a systematic review, which was performed in 2024 for 17065, like all systematic review ballots, has 4 choices. Confirm, which we saw before, that means continue to publish the standard as is, no revisions. Revise, if a member body votes to revise, that means they want to open up the entire standard, revise it all, and that's a second choice. The third choice is withdraw, meaning the member body to ISO CASCO feels, well, this standard isn't needed anymore, so let's just withdraw it and stop publishing it. And finally, if the member body can't come to a consensus decision, it can always vote to abstain. Now, it's interesting and significant to note that historically, in ISO CASCO's history, there has never been a 10-year-old standard or a standard that's older than 10 years that has been voted to be confirmed on a systematic review ballot, right? Now, also, and here's where this subcommittee angle comes in, when a systematic review ballot gets delivered to an ISO CASCO member body, there is no CASCO subcommittee that's dedicated to that standard, and so that systematic review ballot, like the one for 17065, is given to the CASCO member for them to consider as a whole. And it's completely up to them how they want to consider that systematic review ballot. And in many cases, there may be individuals who are voting or thinking about that at the national member body level that don't really have any knowledge or activity with that particular standard. So given all this, it was kind of a foregone conclusion that the systematic review ballot this year of 17065 would vote to revise, because, you know, that's what has always been done in the past. But that's not what the actual results were. And this is really interesting. So for the first time, ISO CASCO members voted to confirm a standard that was more than 10 years old. And I'd like to just briefly look at these numbers. Note that of the members who voted, 35 voted to confirm 17065, 32 voted to revise. Okay, so simple majority. Generally, we'll talk about this in a minute, but simple majority generally makes the decision about a systematic review ballot. Interestingly, there were 8 CASCO members who abstained because they could not achieve consensus about the systematic review ballot. And the United States, ANSI, was one of those 8. We simply couldn't come to a consensus about what to do with this standard. Another 15 members abstained because they said, look, we don't have any expertise about the document. Maybe we don't use it. We don't have anybody who's familiar with it. So, you know, we're going to leave this to the other members to decide. And 2 CASCO member bodies simply didn't return the vote. But if you look at this voting and break it down into 2 groups, you see 2 very different stories. First, if you look at the group of CASCO member bodies that are within Europe, and I'm talking about Europe as a region here, not the European Union necessarily, but if you look at the CASCO member bodies within Europe, there are 26 of those, and you add in the US, Canada, Japan, China, Australia, and India. If you look at all those, you'll find that there were 12 votes to confirm and 18 to revise. So among this group of CASCO member bodies, there was a pretty clear and strong, sentiment to revise the document. Outside of those members, for all the other members of ISO CASCO, it was just the opposite. 23 voted to confirm and only 14 voted to revise. So when you put it all together, the total was to confirm rather than revise, with a very different look and decision based on the kind of CASCO members that voted. Now, in the directives, a systematic review ballot, the action to take as a result of the systematic review ballot, the directives tell us, is based on a simple majority. But the directives go on to say, however, in some cases, a more detailed analysis of the results may indicate another interpretation. That means there's some mechanism that might be used to come to a different conclusion than just what the majority had voted upon. And the consideration of that in CASCO is taken by the Chair's Policy and Coordination Group, the CPCG. This is a group of CASCO member bodies and representatives that support and advise the CASCO chair. Now, as you can see on the slide, the membership on the CPCG is much more heavily weighted in one of the groups than the other. So you might suspect, oh, well, perhaps the CPCG will have a different perspective and overturn that ballot. But to their credit, they didn't. Apparently, they did not see anything in the ballot results that caused them to feel that the majority should not have its say. But it's still not the end of the story, okay? Because now we've confirmed 17065. As a result, you would think that the next systematic review of 17065 would be in 2029. Now, that would not happen if in the intervening time, some proposal is submitted for a revision. Also, even though 17065 was confirmed, it's noted by all the users of the document that the ISO IEC 17000 standard on terminology, that's the one that ISO IEC 17065 took particular note of when it was developed, see, that document was revised in 2020. And as we all know, those of us who use 17065 in our daily work, some of the terms and definitions in 17065 are now out of date. They don't really match the existing terminology standard. Also, as those of us who use the document know, there are a fair number of documents that are referenced in 17065 that have been withdrawn. They do not exist anymore. Some have been replaced, but one way or the other, many of the reference documents just aren't there anymore. And finally, the ISO CASCO common elements on which the 17065 original version was based were also revised and republished in 2020. Now, I'm going to get into the detail about what those common elements are a little bit later on. But just suffice to say that, yes, we confirmed the standard, but there are some of these disconnects. And so now what enters the scenes is an amendment. And what is an amendment? Well, the directives, the ISO directives, allow for an amendment, and they say that an amendment alters the technical provisions of an international standard. Okay. It goes on to say an amendment is considered a partial revision. The rest of the international standard is not open for comments. So what this means is that when an amendment is proposed, the proposal for the amendment needs to indicate specifically what it is that's going to be changed in the standard. And anything outside of that description, if the amendment goes forward, stays the same. It can't be changed. So shortly after the Systematic Review Ballot of 17065, a proposal for an amendment to 17065 was submitted to the ANSI ICAC, the ANSI National Mirror Committee to ISO CASCO. That amendment proposal was unanimously approved by the ANSI ICAC and subsequently sent to ISO CASCO with a request that it be balloted to the CASCO member bodies. And that ANSI proposal for an amendment to 17065 is now out to ballot for the ISO CASCO member bodies to consider. So as in the past, 17065 continues to be something of an unprecedented standard within CASCO. This amendment is actually the first proposal for an amendment to an ISO CASCO standard or any ISO CASCO document. ISO CASCO has never processed an amendment before. As a result, this ballot that's currently out is the first ballot of a proposal for an amendment to an ISO CASCO document. And all the ISO member bodies are currently considering it and deciding how to vote on it. If the amendment proposal is adopted by the ISO CASCO members, again, it would be by simple majority. This would be the resultant amendment to 17065 would obviously be the first amendment published by ISO CASCO. So here's good old 17065, which seems to have been around forever, but is breaking new ground yet again. Now, what is the amendment process? So let's assume that this ballot proposal passes. So recall that there is no standing subcommittee for ISO 17065. We don't use subcommittees in ISO CASCO. As a result, CASCO will need to form a working group to create the amended text per the proposal. The ANSI proposal for the amendment names a candidate for the convener of such a working group, and that individual is Kotaro Yoshida, and we appreciate his gracious offer to do this work. He's under the Japan National Member Body to ISO CASCO. And the proposal itself lists 3 specific types of changes. And so only these 3 types of changes would be made if the amendment proposal is adopted. Because as the directives state, the rest of the international standard is not open for comments. So let's talk about what the 3 types of changes are in this amendment proposal. Well, they're going to sound familiar. First, the first area of change is update the terminology so that it matches ISO IEC 17000:2020. Now, this is important because if we don't do this, then when we use 17065 in its current form, we're going to have to reach back and use the old version of 17000, the old terminology to understand what that standard means. But when we use any of the other CASCO toolbox standards, we'll use the new 17000 to understand what the terms mean in those standards. That's pretty complicated, and so we want to take that away. And so the amendment, by making changes, would avoid this different or unique terminology for 17065. And as we all know, standards really come to life when they're referenced in a contract or regulation or legislation. Until then, they're fascinating pieces of paper or PDF files on our computer. And so having the same terminology apply to 17065 is going to make it easier to adopt in a contract, a regulation, or in legislation. A couple of examples of what this updated terminology are. 17,000/2020 defines third-party activities. And that's the only definition it has for anything about third party. And 17065 uses terms like third parties or third party bodies. And so there's a little disconnect here. But we can get that straightened out with some basic changes that clarify, but don't make any changes to the meaning of 17065. In addition, certification schemes per 17,000/2020 now means something relatively different than it used to mean. Schemes now are comprised of rules and procedures, but the 17065 uses some terminology like scheme requirements that really reflect back on the previous definition of schemes. And as I said, 17065 separates requirements for schemes and bodies, but it still has plenty of references to schemes. So it seems like those should be consistent with the current definition. The second kind of change is obviously to delete or replace the references to documents that are no longer published. Believe it or not, if you look in the bibliography of 17065, there are 18 documents listed there. 12 of them don't exist anymore. One of them only is referenced in the bibliography of 17065. It doesn't appear in the body of the standard. So there's some cleanup work there that needs to be done. What we're proposing is to replace the outdated references with the new documents that have replaced them, or to delete the references when there is no replacement. So some examples of that, and perhaps the biggest one, is ISO IEC 17021. We know that ISO IEC 17021 is normatively referenced in 17065, but technically 17021 does not exist anymore. It's no longer published. Instead, 17021-1 is now the standard that has taken its place. And so the amendment proposes to update the references from 17021 to 17021-1. And again, it's just editorial. Another example is Guide 28. Guide 28 actually goes all the way back in its original form to 1982, and it's guidance on third-party certification systems for products. That document doesn't exist anymore and has been replaced by more robust documents, 3 different technical reports. And so it seems appropriate that 17065 should point to these technical reports for information about those kinds of schemes. Now, the third change that's proposed in the amendment is about a very specific clause in 17065, Clause 8.8 on preventive action. This clause is being replaced in all the other CASCO standards as they are revised. And in all the other CASCO standards, it's being replaced with a clause that's titled Actions to Address Risks and Opportunities. And the title of this clause 8.8, or whatever it is in the pertinent CASCO standard, this title, Actions to Address Risks and Opportunities, this comes from the ISO CASCO common elements. And, we're going to talk about the common elements here in a moment, but the preventative action clause is changing because ISO CASCO wants to support organizations that fulfill the 17,000 series standards, and they also choose to fulfill ISO management system standards. And so we want to create parallels wherever possible between those two standards. Now, ISO IEC 17,000 standards are not management system standards. They're very different, but some requirements are similar, and some organizations do fulfill both types of standards, so it's appropriate to make the parallels in them when we can. If you want to read more about the difference between the two types of standards, ANAB has a 3-part blog that we posted just last month, and that walks through how they're different and even uses a little case study to illustrate that. But back to the amendment changes. So the ISO CASCO common elements, I've mentioned them now several times, and I keep promising to explain them, and here's where I'm going to do so. There are common elements for all ISO CASCO standards for bodies, for conformity assessment bodies and accreditation bodies. They deal with certain areas and certain requirements that ISO CASCO has decided can be and should be identical in each of the standards. The original common elements were published in 2005 as publicly available specifications, and they included a structure for ISO CASCO standards with required names of headings, and they also included specific requirements text that would be shared among different ISO CASCO standards. 17065 reflects those old common elements. As a matter of fact, in the bibliography to 17065, you can see the references to them. It's publicly available specifications 17,001, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Well, since then, this common element library, if you will, has been revised, and the newest version is published as a CASCO internal procedure, Procedure 33, or PROC 33, as it's often referred to. And the new version of the common elements are much less detailed. Okay, there's far less detail than the original common elements. And in the current PROC 33 common elements, the title of the clause, Actions to Address Risks and Opportunities, that's the only required thing to be put into each CASCO standard. Just the clause heading, just the name of the heading. The content of that clause, the actual requirements under that clause, that's open for each CASCO standard to decide for itself what it should say. But in any case, a clause on actions to address risks and opportunities is replacing the current preventive action clause. And so the amendment proposal says, let's do that so that 17065 can make this change and be in step with all the other standards. So as I mentioned, the content of this new clause, actions to address risks and opportunities, is not laid down in the common elements. So in the draft amendment to 17065, the proposal suggests specific content that is logically linked with other 17065 management system section requirements. So the idea is that the text we're proposing actually refers to and links up with other management system requirements. Now, other ISO CASCO standards, when it comes to this new clause, they've borrowed generic management system content for this clause. The problem is it's perfectly appropriate and makes perfect sense in a management system standard. But when you take that text and you plop it down into the middle of a management system section of an ISO CASCO standard, it seems to duplicate other management system section requirements. And that's a little confusing because it seems like the document is now saying the same thing twice. That makes it unnecessarily difficult to use and to fulfill. Now, so we've got an amendment. These are the three areas that the amendment is suggesting be changed. Let's talk about what's not changing, right? Because in an amendment process, you are restricted to only changing what the amendment proposal has defined. The first thing that's not changing, there are no other changes from the 2020 revision of PROC 33, these common elements, that will be implemented as a result of this amendment. Any other changes in the PROC 33 common elements are excluded. Secondly, and this is important, the headings, the names of the headings, and the numbering of ISO IEC 17065 will not change. All of that will stay the same. Why is this so important, you say? Well, stop and think. Imagine how many checklists and compliance manuals and reports and spreadsheets are out there in the world today, and they're all based on the current 17065 structure, the numbering of the clauses and the names of the clauses. Wow, there's a lot that's out there. So by taking this amendment process, we make sure that none of that changes. And so that bodies that do internal audits or the bodies that fulfill 17065 or peer evaluation processes or accreditation processes, whoever it is, all those documents they've created based on the structure of 17065 stay the same, and you don't have to redo them. In addition, there is no other, right? There's no other new content or new headings, so there's no additional headings that are included in the 2020 revision of the common elements. But here's the thing. The current requirements in 17065 address all of those areas. So it's not like 17065 is going to have any holes or missing pieces in it. Now, because there are no substantive changes to the requirements for certification bodies, there should be no significant change in the fulfillment of 17065. As a matter of fact, it's expected that the existing fulfillment, how certification bodies today fulfill 17065, will be unaffected or only slightly affected based on that change to the preventive action clause. I think when you see amended text, you'll see that the new actions to address risks and opportunities are going to fall in line with activities and the ways you fulfill other management system requirements. Now, that means that there should be no need for special audits, for transition periods, for any significant change in the flow of how organizations use and demonstrate their fulfillment of 17065. For example, if your internal audit function, or if you're a certification body and you fulfill 17065, your internal audit function should not have to undertake any sort of special new activity after the document is amended. They can pick up these changes in the normal cycle of their internal audits. They should be very, very minimal. And so the idea here is that we bring 17065 up to date without causing really any significant disruption. Now, another thing that's not changing, though, is our old friends option A and option B in the management system section will still be there, okay? Now, these were based, again, document was written between 2006 and 2012. The original options A and options B were kind of based on ISO 9001 as it existed at the time. And there were some pretty significant parallels between 9001 and 17065 way back when. Well, we all know ISO 9001 and management systems in general have evolved since then. And that parallelism between the two is far less today than it has been in the past. So everybody recognizes now that options A and B don't really have any practical impact. Whenever anyone assesses the fulfillment of 17065, they quickly realize that they have to gather evidence of all of the requirements that make up option A, and they do so. So we thought about in our amendment proposal, well, should we address this? And in the end, we came to the conclusion that removing this option A and option B would probably have required a significant change in the text, or perhaps even the numbering and structure of the clauses in 17065. And so we didn't think that was really justified, especially based on the results of the systematic review, where the whole document was really confirmed as is. So 17065 will continue to set no requirements on schemes. There is absolutely nothing that changes in that regard. 17065 will continue to be usable whether products, processes, or services are being certified. In other words, Annex B will continue to be applicable. Annex B shows you literally how to replace words in 17065 so that it reads correctly when you certify services, and how it reads correctly when you certify processes. And in addition, 17065 will continue to be usable no matter what type of specified requirements you are using in the scheme to certify products, processes, and services. But really, frankly, there's more that's not changing than what is. So to sum things up, in general, the assurance that has been provided by fulfillment of 17065 has been effective and proven for 12 years. That seems evident by that systematic review ballot results from just this year. So there's not really any justification for any significant change, especially when you think about the cost and burden that such a change would trigger throughout the conformity assessment community. However, updates to terminology and reference documents will help bring 17065 up to date, use the same terminology as all the other ISO CASCO standards, and make it as easily referenced as those other CASCO standards. And the one real difference with other CASCO standards from 17065 as it sits today is this preventive action clause, and that's being addressed. But the draft changes are more clear, at least the proposed changes are more clear than the other CASCO standards content in this area, and they increase the linkage with other 17065 management system requirements. Now, beyond 17065, this amendment process really sets a precedent. So in the past, CASCO standards always had to be open for full revision to make updates and improvements. But here's an amendment process that gives us a new option. Now, if CASCO standards are effective now, and they just need small incremental changes, can we do that? Well, yes, if this amendment process works, we have that new path. And finally, if the amendment process works, there's also the tool of a correction that's available from the ISO directives. It's kind of a sister of an amendment. And that would be just the idea of having a new tool. CASCO might look for using a correction to correct an inadvertent error or ambiguity. So, this is hopefully opening the eyes to a new tool. So to sum up and briefly to end here, what's next? Well, if the CASCO ballot passes, first it has to close, but if it passes, the decision will be by simple majority whether to adopt this amendment proposal or not. If the amendment proposal is adopted, the limited changes I've described will go forward. If it's rejected, nothing changes. 17065 is exactly the way it is today, and it goes forward with no changes whatsoever. Of course, there's no subcommittee here, so CASCO would have to form a working group to implement the amendment, and that per the amendment proposal, that working group would have an 18-month target to complete the work. And the stages in an amendment process are like standard stages. There's a committee draft, there's a draft amendment stage, and there's a final draft amendment stage. And these parallel the stages for standards developments. However, it's not clear, at least not to me, if the final draft amendment stage is optional, just like the final draft international standard stage is optional. In addition, here's the last important thing I want to note. Prior to the final approval stage, CASCO, as the committee, can consider, in consultation with the ISO Chief Executive Officer, balloting the amended document, the amended 17065, as a new published edition. Why would that be helpful? Well, imagine there are numerous, but really not very consequential, but numerous changes that are going to come out of this amendment process. Which would you prefer? Would you like to have the old 17065 document and a separate document with lots of changes, and you have to read both to figure out what's happening? Or would you like a new version of 17065 with all the amendments incorporated therein? It seems to me that the second one would be really useful, but that'll be a decision for ISO CASCO to take. So I hope I've shown you that unprecedented and 17065 do belong in the same sentence. In the past, the length and the effort put into its development was unprecedented. And the breadth of coverage in this document for the object of conformity, every kind of product, process, and service, that's unprecedented. The full separation in 17065 of requirements for the body and anything related to the scheme, that is unprecedented. And finally, when it was developed, references to the other ISO 17000 series in 17065 was also and continues to be unprecedented. Going forward, or as of today, it sets some new precedents. It's the first 10-plus-year-old standard to be confirmed on a systematic review ballot. It's the first document in ISO CASCO to have a proposed amendment. If it's passed, it'll be the first amended CASCO standard. And finally, if the first new edition is a new publication of the standard with the amendments incorporated, it'll be a first in that regard as well. So that brings me to the end of the sequence and the story of events with 17065 and what's happening with it today. I'm going to turn it back over to Melanie briefly, and then we'll have some Q&A.
Great, thank you, Keith. That was a great presentation. I certainly learned some new information about the process of amending international standards. We have had some questions come in, but in order to give you some time to enter your questions into the Q&A panel, I'm going to go over some resources that are available for accredited organizations or organizations seeking accreditation or just interested in conformity assessment in and of itself. We have many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessments. On the ANAB website, we have a few free webcasts on a variety of different topics. They're about 5 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and you can view them at any time. We also have a blog page Keith mentioned earlier with a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standards requirements, conformity assessment, and many other topics. We also do these webinars monthly, and we actually have had 2 this month and 2 last month, and we have 1 planned in December as well. So you can visit the ANAB website to see the schedule of webinars, as well as to view the recordings of all previous webinars all the way back to 2020. We offer training on a variety of different topics, including internal audits, standards, risks, and other topics. We are going to be releasing a course next week on 17020 with a CMMC twist on it. So take a look at our website, see what we have to offer. And we also offer private training if the course that you need is slightly different than what we offer. And we have a variety of self-paced training too. All of these resources can be found on the ANAB website at anab.ansi.org. And now we will get into your questions. So Keith, the first question that came in is, can you expand on your explanation about 17065 as it relates to schemes? 17065 has no requirements that schemes must fulfill. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And that was kind of a remarkable feature right from the beginning when it was published. Now, you know, I'm kind of building it up as something very special, but when you stop and think about it, it was kind of out of necessity. And why do I say that? Well, 17065 is requirements for the certification body. Now, and it's for a certification body that certifies products, processes, and services. So a certification scheme is a set of rules and procedures that generally, one of the big facets of the scheme is it provides the methodology for how to certify a product, a process, or a service. It also identifies the specified requirements that they need to meet. Think about how many different variations there are of different kinds of certification schemes to certify a product, a process, or a service. My goodness, that covers a huge variety of certification schemes. What could we possibly say in one standard that would be applicable to every single one of those kinds of schemes? Well, not very much. And so it was not only a decision that we thought would make 17065 more effective. In all candor, it was also a decision that we took because we thought we could actually get the work done by not having to address anything related to schemes. So yes, you are absolutely correct. There are no requirements for certification schemes in 17065. There are only requirements that the certification body must perform in accordance with the scheme, but not the scheme itself.
Okay, our next question is, can 17065 be used to accredit bodies that register hospitals using 17020?
Okay, well, and that's a great question. And but we can make it a generic question. And the generic question is, can ISO IEC 17065 be used as requirements for bodies that certify and fill in anything else that you want? In this case, it's hospitals. Well, according to 17065, these are requirements that are suitable when a certification body is certifying a product, a process, or a service. So when you say certifying hospitals, well, that can mean a number of different things. Do you mean the building and facilities that make up the hospital? That could be considered a product. Do you mean certifying a hospital for some of its processes, patient intake, sterilization? Yes, you can certify processes in a hospital as a certification body fulfilling 17065. And finally, what about service? Can you certify a service if you're a certification body fulfilling 17065? Are those the right requirements if you're certifying a service? Yes, of course. That's right there in the scope. That means, however, that there must be requirements that pertain to the service. And so the certification body would be all about demonstrating fulfillment, that those service requirements fulfill that the service fulfills the service requirements. Now, in the course of any of those types of certification, you may perform, or the certification scheme may tell a body to perform inspection activities, right? And so inspection activities per 17065 are required to be performed by a body that fulfills the applicable requirements of 17020. So if one of the activities in your certification process can be considered inspection, then yes, the body that performs those activities not only could fulfill 17020, it's actually required by 17065 to fulfill the applicable requirements of 17020. So in that perspective, the answer that I see is yes, I can envision certification of a hospital, whatever aspect you're certifying, could be considered a product, process, or service certification, and inspection could be an activity that's undertaken in that certification, and thus the body performing it is required to fulfill the applicable requirements of 17020.
Okay, our next question is multi-part. When will the ballot on the amendment close? If it is approved, when do you anticipate final implementation? And finally, how will ANSI be voting?
Okay, so there's three questions there. When does it close? Oh, I should have looked this up and been prepared. I believe it closes in December. The second is, when would we expect implementation? By implementation, I assume when is the work done and the final and the amendments in one form or another are finally published. What ANSI has proposed is that work be completed within 18 months. So that would be if the ballot does indeed close in December next month, and 18 months from then would be the middle of 2026. Isn't that amazing? We're talking about 2026. So the amendments you would expect to be somewhere in the middle or latter half of 2026. And how does ANSI propose to vote? Well, as you might expect, this was an ANSI proposal. And ANSI, the National Mirror Committee, voted unanimously on the proposal to submit it. So when the ballot came back to ANSI to vote on this, our secretariat very wisely said, we are voting to approve. and so that's the way ANSI will vote.
Okay, great. The next question. The development of the new ISO 42001 Artificial Intelligent Management Standard had to take into consideration both 17021-1 and 17065. Any comments on how the changes to 17065 may impact 42001 in the future? And what examples of 42001 are a reflection of the influence of 17065?
Sure. I will give you the generic answer that, as I stressed, in my view, 17065 gets some refreshment in terms of terminology and reference documents. So to the extent that 17065 is helpful and useful for 42001, it'll be just as helpful and useful going forward. To the extent that it is not applicable and not particularly useful for 42001, it will continue to be not applicable and not useful to 42001. In other words, whatever the relationship is today, it won't, if the amendment passes, it won't change. There will be no change in that relationship, good or bad. And I've looked at the 42001 standard. Frankly, I don't see a heavy influence from 17065 in that document. It's a very clear standard. It follows the harmonized structure for management system standards. But that is not the kind of standard nor the kind of object of conformity assessment that 17065 expects a certification body to be dealing with. So to me, I don't see a strong connection there. So there would not be a strong connection in the future.
Right. So our last question in the Q&A box right now is, if not in 17065, then where do requirements for certification schemes exist?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So ISO CASCO, as of today, does not publish requirements for certification schemes. Let me say that again. ISO CASCO today does not publish requirements for certification schemes. And I'm going to take a minute or two to explain that. ISO CASCO certainly publishes guidance to help people understand schemes, to help people develop schemes, to know what they're getting into, to understand the role they play in conformity assessment, and to foster, frankly, to help and facilitate schemes to be developed where they're needed. Now, why doesn't ISO CASCO publish requirements for certification schemes? And this is more my personal opinion or my personal observation, but I'm happy to share it. In effect, the scheme, when a scheme is developed, almost by necessity, the individual organizations or the regulators or the market operators, whoever they are, whoever is going to use and choose to rely on that scheme, they are almost always involved in the development of the scheme in some way. I'm not saying that everybody comes and sits around the table and writes the scheme, but for example, if I develop a scheme tomorrow and I want a federal government agency to refer to that scheme and utilize that scheme, I'm not going to write it all by myself, never ask them for their input, never involve them, and then just present them with a scheme and say, here, isn't this great? That's a recipe for a lot of wasted time and effort. It's the participants and the users in a scheme that are the best equipped to decide the specifics of what a scheme should be and what the balance is in a scheme between the activities that are needed to deliver assurance about fulfillment of specified requirements, to balance that assurance need with the costs that are going to arise by operating the scheme. ISO CASCO, philosophically, me personally, up to this point, has not seen the ability to create a requirements document to help capture that balance. I still think that's counterproductive. And so CASCO, my personal opinion, not CASCO decision, my personal opinion is it's appropriate that CASCO doesn't develop requirements for schemes because it's the interested parties themselves. They're the ones that need to come together and decide what the content of a scheme is. And if they don't get this balance correct between the assurance needed and the costs, the scheme will naturally fail. It won't be implemented, or it'll be implemented and it'll cease being used. So there's kind of a self-correcting nature to the development of schemes that is most efficiently left to the market and not as a set of requirements from an international standards body.
Excellent, excellent. That was a very good explanation. I like that. So we have some really great questions today. Thank you all for bringing those questions to Keith to further explain ISO CASCO and schemes and the 17065 development. Keith, I thank you for presenting today for ANAB on this excellent topic. I look forward to our next webinar next Thursday. And I have up on the screen some contact information. If you are interested in training or accreditation, you can email the email addresses here on the screen. And as a reminder, we are recording this, and that recording should be up within the next week on the ANAB website, where our free webinars are listed. Thank you all for attending.